Hey everyone, Skeptical Skeptic back again, this time with just a short summary of my thoughts on the Book of Genesis, not to be confused with my actual summary video for the Book of Genesis. This video is just going to be my pure opinion of the book that I had after reading again for the third time. I'm planning to do reviews for all of the books of the Bible after I do my summaries for them, though in all honesty, for some of the much shorter books to come later on, I'll probably just end up grouping my thoughts together for multiple books in one review. But anyway, the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Let's just get to what I thought about it. So when I originally sat down to read through all of Genesis for the first time when I was 16, it was very off-putting to me. Despite the fact that I had technically already read like half of it beforehand in short segments for Catholic school, the segments I had read really did not age well, and the segments I hadn't read were very strange to me. At the time, I just thought that the Bible was kind of, finding its footing. I mean, it's very common for a piece of fiction to start off pretty rocky in the beginning and then find its footing later on. And I was expecting to find the next few chapters of the Bible to be much more entertaining to read. However, I couldn't have been more wrong, and the chapters that come after Genesis suffer a massive decline in quality, and Genesis was but a small taste of the bullshit that was to come. But I'll get to that in future reviews. For now, let's focus on what I thought about Genesis. As implied before, when you look at Genesis without rose-colored glasses and without an apologist to spoon-feed a particular interpretation to you, it's just an incredibly weird story. Like when you're a kid, you don't really question this shit because you've been conditioned all your life to believe it. When a talking snake convincing a woman to eat a fruit that will give her knowledge of good and evil, a guy building a boat to bring every pair of animal in the world onto to repopulate the entire world after God floods it all. This shit is really weird, man. But in addition to all the stories that kids were taught about during their childhood, there's also all the parts of Genesis that were less focused on. Like the fact that according to the Bible, giants apparently once roamed the earth, and people lived for hundreds of years back in the old days, which the Bible just sort of drops as something humans are able to do as it goes on. And of course there's the fact that the character of God appears almost unrecognizable from the omnipotent, omniscient, spaceless, timeless being that he is popularly portrayed as nowadays in the Christian religion. At the time the book of Genesis was written, it is clear that the concept of God was very infantile, as he is portrayed in the book as a kind of wizard rather than a force of nature. He's often portrayed as not being aware of things, like when he struggles to find Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and he needs to send angels to check to see if there are any righteous people in the city of Sodom. There are also times where God gets into arguments, like where Abraham managed to change the unchanging God's mind and convince him to spare the city of Sodom if he found at least 10 righteous people there. He is also very clearly portrayed as a physical person with a body, as he does things like him sitting down and eating a meal with Abraham, and him literally getting into a wrestling match with Jacob, and losing. Yes, the Almighty God lost to a wrestling match to a mere mortal. My headcanon is that God demands constant worship all the time from his followers just to feel better about that one time he got his ass beat and never forgot about it. There are also times in Genesis where there are aspects of polytheism that shine through, with God often referring to the beings of heaven as we and us, clearly implying that God is not the only deity to exist. These aspects of God would be phased out gradually as the Bible continues, and when it gets to the New Testament, his portrayal is a lot closer to modern interpretations of him. But it is very interesting to see how drastically the ancient Israelite view of God differed so drastically from what the Abrahamic God would one day become. There are also a lot of other weird aspects of Genesis that aren't focused on too much in Christian education, and I can see why, because Genesis actually gets pretty damn raunchy at points. The enjoyable kind of raunchy, not the capturing of little girls from foreign nations and taking them as your wives kind of raunchy that would be seen in later chapters. Like, there's that really weird subplot where Joseph is still being held captive in Egypt, where Judah's sons keep dying because God doesn't like them, so the woman he got to marry them dresses up as a prostitute and has sex with her father-in-law, bearing his twins. Or the 3 separate instances of characters pretending that their wives are actually their sisters, and the leader of the cities they travel to deciding to take their wives into their harem because of how hot they are, or when Lot's daughters get him drunk and have him knock them up because their mother got turned into salt. But by far the raunchiest, most hilarious part of Genesis was Jacob's love life, where his 2 wives and their maidservants basically kept trying to one-up each other in how many babies they could produce. It's pure classic Bible hilarity at its absolute finest. Of course, it's not all fun and games, as there are still quite a few horrific things in the book of Genesis. Flooding the entire world and killing all of its inhabitants definitely comes to mind, as honestly it's probably the worst thing God ever did throughout the whole Bible in terms of its scale and carnage. But honestly, killing off the population of the entire world in a flood is not really one of the more graphic slaughters carried about by God in the Bible. It's not as personally horrific as, for example, God making Jephthah sacrifice his daughter to him in Judges 11. Yeah, Abraham definitely got off easy in Genesis, and it is probably for that reason that the Noah's Ark story is taught to kids, while the Jephthah story is quietly swept under the rug. There are, of course, other instances of God acting like a total dick in Genesis, like when he slaughters everyone in Sodom and Gomorrah and turns Lot's wife into a pillar of salt for just looking back. But quite honestly, compared to some of the actions and laws that the Bible is going to get into in later books, God's cruelty is kind of tame in Genesis in comparison. Speaking of laws, by the way, one thing I really appreciate about Genesis as compared to other books of the Bible is that it doesn't focus ridiculous amounts of time on boring laws and sacrifice instructions. For the most part, the book of Genesis is pretty fast-paced, with it spanning about 2,000 years in time from beginning to end, and mostly focusing on story elements. I mean, yeah, there are parts where you have to read through some tedious, pointless genealogies, but those are kind of few and far between. Contrast the book of Genesis with, say, for example, the book of Leviticus, where the story doesn't move forward at all, and the entirety of it is just the Israelites being on the road to the Promised Land, while God spends like 25 chapters listing out sacrifice instructions and explaining how to cure leprosy. I know the Bible is supposed to serve as like the moral guidance and instruction for Christians and all, but if people claim these books are good literature, that's not good literature. It's boring as hell. And I think the strongest compliment I can give the book of Genesis is that it is anything but boring. It's incredibly entertaining to read, though entertainingly bad, of course. But that's certainly better than a lot of the other books in the Bible, which are just plain bad and incredibly tedious to read through. It is true that Genesis does get repetitive sometimes, repeating certain tropes, like how I was saying before, there are 3 separate instances of characters pretending that their wives are actually their sister. And I think the final arc of the book with Joseph's character really does drag on, with him lying to his brothers and not revealing who he is for, well, really no reason at all, but it's never too gratuitous. The book offers enough wacky, varied stories that it was enough to keep me interested. But like I said, I'm not saying the book of Genesis is actually good. Far from it. The stories were utterly nonsensical and ridiculous. None of the characters were likable or endearing, except for maybe Joseph, who actually goes through a kind of compelling character arc from getting betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery to eventually working himself up to become the hero of Egypt. But in general, the characters in Genesis are extremely flat and underdeveloped, making all kinds of nonsensical decisions for the sake of the plot, like Esau handing over his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of soup. As for good morals, yeah, right. The main lesson I took away from Genesis is that women are pieces of garbage whose only purpose in life is to bear children. You shouldn't listen to them or you will be led astray. And if someone comes to try to rape you, you should offer up your daughters to them to be raped instead. The only point in the book of Genesis where I would say the writing is even slightly passable is in the last third, which has to do with Joseph's story, which is at the very least a consistently told story arc with a narrative payoff and character development. And I actually think the death of Israel as he says goodbye to all his sons was a pretty satisfying way to end the book. But overall, yeah, the book of Genesis is pretty bad, but it definitely ranks among classics like the Song of Songs in the so bad it's good category of the Bible, which is much more than I can say for the series of books I will be reviewing next. Anyway, that was it. Review over. Be sure to like and subscribe. Bye.